Imagine a land where over 100 million people once lived in harmony with nature for thousands of years, until three small ships appeared on the horizon in 1492, changing everything forever. This is the story of America, not the sanitized version you learned in school, but the raw, brutal, inspiring, and absolutely incredible true story of how a handful of rebels built the most powerful nation in human history. From genocide to glory, from slavery to freedom, from 13 colonies to global superpower. This is how America really happened. And trust me, the truth is far more dramatic than any Hollywood movie. Welcome to the epic story of America. Before we talk about America, we need to talk about the people who were already here. In 1491, North America wasn't an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was home to over 100 million Native Americans living in sophisticated civilizations. The Haudenosaunee, what Europeans called the Iroquois, had created a democratic confederation that would later inspire the American Constitution. The Cherokee had developed their own written language. The Cahokia built cities larger than London. But then Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean. Columbus wasn't looking for America. He was trying to reach Asia to trade spices. When he realized he'd found something else entirely, he called the inhabitants Indians because he thought he'd reached the Indies. It was the beginning of the greatest collision between worlds in human history. European diseases like smallpox, to which Native Americans had no immunity, killed 90% of the indigenous population within a century. Entire civilizations vanished almost overnight. It was demographic catastrophe on an unimaginable scale, but some survived, and they would fight back. By 1607, the English were ready to try something different in the New World. Jamestown, Virginia, became the first permanent English settlement. But it was a disaster. Within 6 months, 80% of the colonists were dead from starvation, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatan Confederation. Captain John Smith saved the colony with one brutal rule: he who does not work does not eat. But it was tobacco that really saved Jamestown. John Rolfe discovered that Virginia's soil was perfect for growing tobacco, and Europe was addicted to it. Suddenly, Virginia was a gold mine. There was just one problem. Tobacco required massive amounts of labor. At first, they used indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked for years to pay off their passage, but that wasn't enough. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown carrying something that would haunt America for centuries: the first enslaved Africans. Meanwhile, 600 miles north, a very different experiment was beginning. In 1620, 102 religious refugees called Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. They weren't seeking gold or tobacco profits. They wanted religious freedom. Their first winter killed half of them. They would have died completely if not for Squanto, a Patuxet Indian who taught them how to grow corn and negotiate with local tribes. But the Pilgrims survived, and more religious groups followed. Massachusetts Bay Colony became a city upon a hill, a Puritan utopia based on strict religious principles. By 1750, 13 distinct colonies lined the Atlantic coast, each with its own character. New England, religious, educated, focused on trade and manufacturing. Middle colonies, diverse, tolerant, agricultural and commercial. Southern colonies, aristocratic, agricultural, dependent on slave labor. 2.5 million people called themselves Americans, but they were still British subjects. That was about to change. The trouble started with money. Britain had just fought the 7 Years' War, what Americans called the French and Indian War, and it was expensive. The British Parliament decided the American colonies should help pay for their own defense. In 1765, they passed the Stamp Act, a tax on all printed materials. Americans were furious. "No taxation without representation," they cried. How could Britain tax them when they had no voice in Parliament? The protests worked. Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but then they tried again with the Townshend Acts, taxing tea, paper, and other goods. Boston became the center of resistance. Samuel Adams organized the Sons of Liberty, a secret group that harassed tax collectors and British officials. Tensions exploded on March 5, 1770. British soldiers, taunted by an angry crowd, opened fire. 5 Americans died in what became known as the Boston Massacre. But the real breaking point came in 1773. Britain gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, cutting out local merchants. In response, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty dressed as Mohawk Indians and dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was an act of economic terrorism that cost Britain millions in today's money. King George III was done playing games. In 1774, he passed the Coercive Acts, what Americans called the Intolerable Acts, essentially placing Massachusetts under military rule. It was the point of no return. Representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't ready for independence yet, but they were ready to resist. Then came April 19th, 1775. British troops marched to Concord to seize a colonial weapons cache. At Lexington Green, they met 77 colonial militia, farmers and shopkeepers who had been training for this moment. Someone fired a shot. To this day, nobody knows who. It was the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. Hold on. Before we continue this incredible story, I need to ask you something. If you're enjoying this epic journey through American history, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're building a community of history lovers who want to understand how we got to where we are today. Also, drop a comment below. What moment in American history fascinates you most? The founding, the Civil War, the rise to superpower status. I read every comment, and your suggestions help shape future videos. And if you want to dive even deeper, check out our complete American history series, link in the description. Now, let's get back to the story, because what happens next will literally change the world forever. Where were we? Oh yes, a group of colonial rebels had just declared war on the most powerful empire on Earth. What could possibly go wrong? By any rational measure, the American Revolution should have been over before it started. Britain had the world's most powerful navy, professional armies, and virtually unlimited resources. The colonies had farmers with hunting rifles and a continental army that rarely had shoes, let alone uniforms. George Washington knew he couldn't win a conventional war, so he invented a new kind of warfare. He would retreat, survive, and wait for Britain to exhaust itself. It almost didn't work. After early disasters in New York, Washington's army was falling apart. On Christmas night 1776, with enlistments expiring and soldiers deserting, Washington made a desperate gamble. He crossed the icy Delaware River and attacked Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. It was barely a battle, more like a surprise raid, but it worked. Suddenly, the revolution had hope again. But the real game changer came from an unlikely source: France. Benjamin Franklin, America's most famous diplomat, arrived in Paris in 1778 wearing a simple fur cap and presenting himself as the embodiment of American simplicity and virtue. French aristocrats were charmed. More importantly, France saw a chance to weaken their British rivals. French money, weapons, and eventually troops turned the tide. The end came at Yorktown in 1781. British General Cornwallis, trapped between Washington's army and French naval forces, had no choice but to surrender. As the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," 8,000 British troops laid down their arms. Against all odds, the Americans had won. But winning independence was only the first challenge. Now they had to figure out how to govern themselves. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, created a government so weak it couldn't even collect taxes. The new nation was drowning in debt and political chaos. By 1787, many thought the American experiment was failing. Then 55 men gathered in Philadelphia for what they called a constitutional convention. In a sweltering room with windows sealed for secrecy, they spent 4 months creating something that had never existed before, a written constitution that balanced power between federal and state governments, created 3 co-equal branches, and established a system of checks and balances. It wasn't perfect. It counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person and left many questions unanswered. But on September 17th, 1787, they had created the framework for the world's first modern democracy. George Washington became the first president, establishing precedents that still guide us today. America was no longer just an idea. It was a working nation, but it was still small, weak, and divided. That was about to change dramatically. In 1703, Napoleon Bonaparte made Thomas Jefferson an offer he couldn't refuse. France needed cash for its European wars and offered to sell the Louisiana Territory, all 827,000 square miles of it, for $15 million. Jefferson wasn't sure the Constitution allowed such a purchase, but he couldn't pass up the deal of the century. Overnight, America doubled in size. Then came the question, what was out there? Lewis and Clark led an expedition to map the new territory and find a route to the Pacific. Their journey revealed an America of breathtaking beauty and unlimited potential. Americans began to believe it was their manifest destiny to spread from sea to shining sea. But expansion came at a terrible cost. As Americans moved west, they displaced hundreds of Native American tribes. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced 100,000 Native Americans from their ancestral lands. The Cherokee Nation, despite adopting European customs and even taking their case to the Supreme Court, were forced on the Trail of Tears, a 1,000-mile death march that killed a quarter of their population. Meanwhile, American settlers in Texas rebelled against Mexico in 1835. After defeats at the Alamo and Goliad, Sam Houston's army won independence at the Battle of San Jacinto. But Texas wanted to join the United States, leading to war with Mexico in 1846. America won decisively, gaining California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought 300,000 people west in search of fortune. San Francisco grew from 200 residents to 36,000 in 2 years. By 1850, America stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. But there was a problem that expansion only made worse: slavery. Every new state raised the same question. Would it be free or slave? The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each attempt to resolve the slavery question only delayed the inevitable. By 1860, America was 2 nations in one: a free North increasingly powered by industry and immigration, and a slave South dependent on cotton and human bondage. Something had to give, and in 1860 it did. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 was the final straw for the South. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states, yet he won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. South Carolina seceded immediately. By February 1861, 7 states had formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: let the Union dissolve or fight to preserve it. The decision was made for him at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. When Confederate forces opened fire on the federal fort on April 12, 1861, Lincoln knew there was no going back. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he had said during his Senate campaign. Now America would discover which house would fall. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history. At first, many thought it would be over in months. The First Battle of Bull Run shattered those illusions. This would be a long, brutal war. The South had better generals initially. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, J.E.B. Stuart were military geniuses. But the North had more people, more factories, more railroads, and more resources. Lincoln understood this was a war of attrition. He found his general in Ulysses S. Grant, a man willing to fight the kind of war needed to win. But Lincoln also understood something deeper. This war had to be about more than just preserving the Union. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in rebelling states. It was brilliant politics and moral leadership. Now the war wasn't just about Union, it was about freedom. The turning point came at Gettysburg in July 1863. For 3 days, 165,000 men fought for the soul of America. Lee's final gamble, Pickett's charge, failed spectacularly. The South would never again threaten Northern territory. 4 months later, Lincoln spoke at the dedication of Gettysburg National Cemetery. In just 272 words, he redefined America. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The war ground on for 2 more bloody years. Sherman's march to the sea devastated Georgia. Grant hammered Lee's army in Virginia. Finally, on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. But the cost was staggering. 620,000 Americans dead, more than all other American wars combined. And just 5 days after Lee's surrender, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The man who had saved the Union was dead. Now came the even harder task, rebuilding America. Between 1865 and 1900, America transformed from an agricultural nation into an industrial superpower. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected East and West Coast for the first time. What once took 6 months by wagon now took 6 days by train. Millions of immigrants flooded into America, Irish fleeing famine, Germans seeking opportunity, Chinese building railroads, Eastern Europeans escaping persecution. They came to cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, where new technologies were changing everything. Andrew Carnegie built a steel empire. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of America's oil. J.P. Morgan became the most powerful banker in the world. These robber barons created unprecedented wealth and unprecedented inequality. Workers responded by organizing. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Pullman Strike of 1894, the formation of the American Federation of Labor. Workers fought for better conditions and fair wages. But nothing could stop America's industrial growth. By 1900, America produced more steel than Britain and Germany combined. American inventions, the telephone, the light bulb, the phonograph, changed how people lived. Ellis Island opened in 1892, processing millions of immigrants who saw America as the land of opportunity. The frontier officially closed in 1890, but America's ambitions were just beginning to expand beyond its borders. In 1898, the Spanish-American War made America a global power for the first time. "Remember the Maine" became the battle cry that won America the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Theodore Roosevelt, who had charged up San Juan Hill, became president in 1901 after McKinley's assassination. Roosevelt embodied the new American confidence. He built the Panama Canal, created national parks, broke up monopolies, and made America a world power. "Speak softly and carry a big stick," he said. By 1914, America was the world's largest economy. Then came a war that would make America the world's most powerful nation. When World War I began in 1914, most Americans wanted to stay out of Europe's problems. "America first," they said. Why should American boys die in foreign wars? President Woodrow Wilson promised to keep America neutral. But Germany's submarine warfare made neutrality impossible. When German U-boats sank the Lusitania, killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, public opinion began to shift. The final straw came in 1917 with the Zimmermann Telegram, Germany's attempt to ally with Mexico against America. Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy. American troops, doughboys, arrived in Europe just in time to tip the balance. The war ended on November 11, 1918. America had emerged as a world power, but Wilson's dream of a League of Nations died when the Senate rejected it. America retreated into isolationism just as the Roaring Twenties began. The 1920s were a decade of unprecedented prosperity and cultural revolution. Jazz music, flapper dresses, automobiles, movies, radio, American culture was being born. Prohibition made alcohol illegal, but couldn't stop Americans from drinking. Speakeasies and bootleggers flourished. The stock market soared. "Everyone ought to be rich," proclaimed a popular magazine. Then came October 29, 1929. Black Tuesday. The stock market crashed, wiping out billions in wealth overnight. The Great Depression followed, the worst economic disaster in American history. By 1932, unemployment reached 25%. Banks failed, farms were foreclosed, bread lines stretched for blocks. Herbert Hoover seemed helpless. Americans elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal for the American people. FDR revolutionized the presidency and the federal government. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work building parks and roads. The Works Progress Administration employed millions. Social Security provided a safety net for the elderly. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," Roosevelt declared. His fireside chats on radio reassured a frightened nation. But it was another world war that truly ended the Depression. And this time, America couldn't stay neutral. On December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America was in the war. What followed was the greatest mobilization in human history. American factories stopped making cars and started making tanks. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became an American icon. America became the arsenal of democracy, supplying not just its own forces, but those of Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies. D-Day, June 6, 1944. American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, opening the second front that would crush Nazi Germany. But the war's end brought a terrible revelation: the Holocaust. American soldiers liberated concentration camps and saw the full horror of Nazi genocide. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, America was preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan that could cost 1 million American lives. Instead, President Harry Truman made the most difficult decision in history. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. World War II was over. America stood alone as the world superpower, economically, militarily, and morally. But the atomic age brought new fears. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, became its Cold War enemy. The nuclear standoff would define the next half-century, from the Berlin airlift to the Cuban Missile Crisis, from Korea to Vietnam, from the space race to the fall of the Berlin Wall. America led the free world against communist tyranny. The civil rights movement fulfilled America's promise of equality. From Rosa Parks to Martin Luther King Jr., from the Little Rock Nine to the March on Washington, African Americans demanded the rights they had been denied since slavery. "I have a dream," Dr. King declared, "that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." America landed on the moon in 1969, proving that free societies could achieve anything. The Cold War ended in 1991 with America victorious, but new challenges awaited: terrorism, globalization, climate change, technological revolution. Through it all, America has remained what Lincoln called the last best hope of Earth, imperfect, but always striving to form a more perfect union. Today, 333 million Americans inherit this incredible story. From 13 colonies to global superpower, from slavery to freedom, from isolation to world leadership, America's story is humanity's story. It's the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It's the story of second chances and new beginnings. It's the story of a nation that has always believed its best days lie ahead. And that story continues today. Because America isn't just a place, it's an idea. The idea that all people are created equal. The idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. The idea that freedom and democracy can triumph over tyranny and oppression. That's the real story of America, and it's far from over. Thanks for joining me on this epic journey through American history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe for more comprehensive historical content. Check out our complete American history series in the playlist below. We dive deeper into each era with detailed episodes. What moment in this story resonated most with you? Drop a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts, and they help shape future content. And remember, understanding our history helps us understand our present and shape our future. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions. This is your host, reminding you that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and who we can become. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.